In July 2012, in the city of Toronto, Canada, a 23-year-old woman disappeared from the lives of everyone who loved her without a word of goodbye, without leaving behind a single trace. Laura Babcock, a University of Toronto graduate, spoke with her mother every day, sometimes several times a day. Less than 72 hours before she disappeared, she stopped by her parents' house, leaving behind her suitcase, a shoebox filled with cash, and her small Maltese dog, which she had never left for very long. These were certainly not the things someone would leave behind when deciding to walk away and start a new life. A love triangle, simmering jealousy, and a promise whispered between two lovers. Prosecutors would later argue that these were the things that set everything in motion. For many months afterwards, the investigation reached almost a complete standstill. Laura's body was never found, nor was there a crime scene in the traditional sense. There was only her former boyfriend, retracing each of her final phone calls, trying to piece together what had really happened. Then, an entirely different case, unfolding in a nearby city, unexpectedly revealed a connection that no one had ever anticipated. Two names began to emerge: the man who had ordered an industrial incinerator worth tens of thousands of dollars shortly before Laura disappeared, and the close friend who stood by his side throughout every step of the plan. No body, no identifiable crime scene. So how could a jury reach a final verdict based almost entirely on circumstantial pieces of evidence gathered over many years? This is the journey to find the answer to one of the most complex and haunting criminal cases in Canadian history, where justice was finally served, even though the person for whom that justice was sought has never truly been found. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you can stay up to date with all the upcoming stories we'll be bringing you. Etobicoke, in the western part of Toronto, was where Laura Babcock grew up, surrounded by her family. Her father, Clayton Babcock, and the rest of the family always maintained a close relationship with her, even after she became an adult and began living independently. After graduating from the University of Toronto, Laura entered a stage of searching for her own direction in life, something entirely normal for many young graduates. Friends described her as cheerful, funny, and someone who loved making the people around her laugh with unexpected jokes. Her small Maltese dog, Lacey, was always by her side, a gift from her former boyfriend, Sean Lerner, who remained a close friend even after they had ended their relationship. On the other side was Dylan Millard, who was born into a wealthy family in Toronto and inherited the private aviation company built by his father, Wayne Millard. With his polished appearance, confidence, and strong financial background, Millard cultivated the image of a successful young businessman in the eyes of many who knew him. Mark Smitch, from Oakville, Ontario, came from a far more modest background than Millard. He dreamed of becoming a rap artist and regularly wrote and recorded street-style music. Smich's relationship with Millard began as a close friendship and gradually developed into a tightly bonded alliance, with Smich frequently appearing alongside Millard in most of his day-to-day activities. At the time this story began, Millard was in a relationship with Christina Nauga, a dental student in Toronto. Their relationship was described as deeply committed, although Millard was simultaneously maintaining other romantic relationships, including one with Laura. The court would later hear that Laura had gone through a difficult period with her mental health in the time before she disappeared, a detail her family shared not to explain what happened afterwards, but to help the jury better understand who she really was, beyond the newspaper headlines. Laura's close friends, who had known her since childhood, described her as a caring person who always took the time to listen to others. Elizabeth Van Rensburg, who had known Laura since they were children, later recalled that their friendship had gone through many ups and downs over the years, but it had never truly faded. As for the Millard family, after Dylan's father, Wayne, died in November 2012, initially ruled a suicide, Dylan inherited most of the family fortune, including a large farm near Waterloo, Ontario, which would later play an important role in the events of this case. Stefan Blasiak, also one of Laura's close friends, stayed in frequent contact with her through text messages and regular meetups. He remembered her distinctive sense of humor. Laura loved pretending to meow like a cat in public just to watch the confused reactions of people around her before bursting into laughter at her own prank. Meanwhile, the relationship between Millard and Nauga became increasingly strained over time, especially as Nauga gradually became aware of the other relationships Millard was maintaining at the same time. The text messages exchanged between them, later presented in court, revealed a complicated picture of jealousy, control, and carefully calculated promises on Millard's part. Although Millard and Smich came from completely different backgrounds, one born into wealth, the other forced to make his own way, they shared one characteristic: both appeared to live by their own rules, paying little regard to the social norms that most of their peers continued to follow. For those who knew all three of them, Laura, Millard, and Smich, no one ever imagined that these seemingly ordinary relationships would soon lead to a chain of events that would permanently change the lives of everyone involved. as well as their families. Late June 2012. Laura no longer had a permanent place to live. She moved from one friend's house to another, taking Lacey and a few bags with her. Late one night, pastry chef Jessica Trevors was outside smoking on her front porch. She saw a taxi pull up. A young woman got out, dragging her luggage and a small dog, then sat down on a park bench nearby. Trevors crossed the street. She introduced herself. Laura told her she had nowhere to go. Trevors invited her to stay at her house. Laura stayed there for 4 days. On 30 June, Trevors drove Laura to her parents' house. I felt comfortable taking her there, Trevors later recalled, because that's where I'd want to go too if I were in the same situation. The two exchanged phone numbers. They hugged goodbye. Later that same day, they spoke on the phone again. Trevors told Laura that she had left behind Lacey's food bowl and her sunglasses. Laura promised she would come back to collect them. She never returned. In early May, her childhood best friend, Elizabeth Van Rensburg, was driving from Kingston to Toronto. Laura's number appeared on her phone. They talked for the entire 2-hour journey. It was the last time they ever spoke. Stefan Blasiak was also in regular contact with Laura during this period. On 1 July, he invited her to stay at his house temporarily. His parents had a strict rule: no dogs were allowed. Laura stayed for only one night. That evening, they watched movies, ate burritos, and laughed constantly. Blasiak recorded a video of Laura pretending to meow like a cat in public, her familiar prank to make people laugh. Just 2 days later, on 3 July, evidence showed that Laura was with Millard. The following day, 4 July, she stopped using her bank account. She stopped using her health insurance. She stopped logging into her social media accounts. Her phone also went silent. Her former boyfriend, Sean Lerner, last saw Laura in late June. After several days passed without any contact, he began to worry. Lerner created a Facebook group to search for her. He traced her phone records. He called every contact number, carefully writing everything down in a small notebook. While reviewing Laura's final phone calls, he noticed something significant. Her last 8 outgoing calls had all been made to Millard. Lerner sent Millard a direct message. "I'm genuinely worried about her safety. I'm not trying to blame anyone. I'm just wondering whether she ever mentioned anything that might help us find her." Millard replied, "I've heard about it, but I don't know where she is." Lerner persuaded Millard to meet him at a Starbucks in Mississauga. There, Millard said that Laura had become involved with drugs and dangerous people. Before they parted, Millard made one more comment that Lerner never forgot. He should not reasonably expect to find her. When he testified years later while representing himself, Millard challenged Lerner's memory of that meeting. Lerner stood by his evidence. "This was probably the most important meeting of my life," he told the court. "What I remember clearly, I remember very clearly." While Lerner continued his determined search, life carried on as normal for everyone else. Friends, colleagues, and family members, none of them imagined the true seriousness of what was happening behind the conversations, the text messages, and the growing silence from Laura. For Laura's family, the silence during the first days of July gradually turned into genuine concern. No witness has ever come forward to say they saw what actually happened to Laura after 3 July. Her body has never been found, nor has a crime scene existed in the traditional sense. Everything the prosecution ultimately had was a series of scattered pieces of evidence gathered through years of painstaking investigation. In early July, Millard purchased a handgun. Not long afterwards, he ordered an animal incinerator worth $15,000. He then spent several $1,000s more to have a custom-built trailer made so the incinerator could be transported easily. On 23 July, evidence indicated that something had been burned inside that incinerator. Location data from Laura's mobile phone showed that she had been in the same area as the phones belonging to Millard and Smitch. After that, her phone signal disappeared completely from every mobile tower. The prosecution argued that this entire sequence of events was not a coincidence. They alleged it was a plan that had been prepared over several months, rather than a spontaneous act. A friend of Smitch later testified that Smitch had boasted about lyrics he had written for one of his rap songs. According to the witness, Smitch said the lyrics were not just a song, they were actually about a real murder. Millard also wrote 65 handwritten letters to Nauga, which police later found in her bedroom. The contents of those letters appeared to construct an alternative narrative, a different explanation for Laura's disappearance. Neither Millard nor Smitch presented any evidence to contradict the prosecution's case. Neither chose to testify. As a result, the jury received no explanation from either man about what had actually happened. A forensic archaeologist was asked to examine small bone fragments, seen in photographs taken from inside the incinerator. The initial findings were controversial. The fragments could have been animal bones rather than human remains. This became one of the central arguments repeatedly emphasized by the defense. Human remains had not been conclusively identified. No human DNA had been recovered from the incinerator either. Ultimately, the case still lacked the most direct form of physical evidence, biological evidence directly linking Laura to that incinerator. It was precisely this absence that made the Laura Babcock case one of the most complex legal challenges Ontario prosecutors had ever faced. The prosecution therefore relied on a different legal strategy, building an overall picture from hundreds of small pieces of evidence, rather than depending on a single decisive piece. Phone records, purchase receipts, old text messages, witness testimony. Each piece, viewed in isolation, might not have been enough to persuade a jury, but when assembled together, they formed a logical chain that the prosecution argued was strong enough to exclude any reasonable possibility other than that Laura was no longer alive. For the Babcock family, watching each piece of evidence being presented brought both relief and heartbreak. Every new detail moved them one step closer to an answer, but it also meant confronting, once again, what may have happened to their daughter. For many years afterwards, the question of what truly happened during that brief period continued to haunt not only Laura's family, but also the investigators who had devoted thousands of hours to reconstructing the truth from the scattered fragments left behind. The Babcock family officially reported Laura missing to Toronto police during the first days of July 2012. It was a necessary step, although they themselves were not entirely sure how to describe the situation. Laura had previously gone through periods of living independently and managing her own life without keeping her family fully informed. Because of this, police initially classified the case as a routine missing person investigation, an adult who had voluntarily left, with no clear indication that a crime had been committed. No body had been found. There was no identifiable crime scene. No witness claimed to have seen anything suspicious. By the usual standards for launching a full-scale criminal investigation, Laura's case met almost none of the necessary criteria. Police accepted the report, recorded the basic information, and placed it among the hundreds of adult missing person cases handled in Toronto each year. For the Babcock family, this was a period of profound helplessness. They knew their daughter was not the kind of person who would disappear without explanation. But without concrete evidence, their conviction alone could not persuade police to act more quickly. It was within that gap that Sean Lerner took on the role of an amateur investigator. Although his efforts were unofficial, they became the most significant source of information during the first several months. At first, Toronto's media paid almost no attention to the case. There was nothing that appeared especially newsworthy. It seemed to be just another missing person case among many similar stories unfolding in a large city every day. Laura's father, Clayton Babcock, later said that those first weeks were among the hardest of his life, not because of bad news, but because there was no news at all. The family repeatedly contacted Toronto police, asking for updates on the investigation. The answer they received time and again was the same. There were no new leads, and the file remained under review. The difference between the urgency felt by the family and the actual pace of the investigation created a deeply frustrating divide. To police, it was one of hundreds of files awaiting attention. To the Babcock family, it was their entire world. Meanwhile, Millard continued living his life as normal in Toronto. He ran the aviation company he had inherited from his father, regularly attended social events, and maintained the image of a successful businessman who appeared unaffected by any outside pressure. Smitch did the same. He continued writing music, meeting friends, and living his everyday life as though nothing unusual had happened in the weeks before. Christina Naudga, Millard's girlfriend, also continued her relationship with him, unaware, or at least not yet fully aware, of the seriousness of what was unfolding behind that seemingly ordinary exterior. Only Sean Lerner and Laura's close friends continued searching for the truth with unwavering determination. The Facebook group Lerner had created attracted more members each week, each contributing small pieces of information in the hope of helping reconstruct the full picture of Laura's final days. It was a grassroots civilian search effort, lacking professional training, but driven by determination, the kind of effort that can sometimes push authorities to take more seriously a case they may initially have underestimated. For months, life for the Babcock family was divided into two completely separate halves. One half struggled to maintain a sense of normality for the sake of the rest of the family. The other was consumed by a single unanswered question. Where was Laura, and why could no one find her? It was that unwavering persistence, combined with an entirely unexpected event that would occur less than a year later, that would finally open the door to the truth the Babcock family had spent so many desperate months searching for. In May 2013, nearly a year after Laura disappeared, an entirely separate case shook the province of Ontario. Tim Bosma, a 32-year-old father from Hamilton, went missing after allowing two strangers to take his pickup truck for a test drive. Hamilton police quickly identified the suspects, Dylan Millard and Mark Smick. While searching Millard's farm near Waterloo, Ontario, investigators made a shocking discovery: a large animal incinerator. Inside, burned bone fragments were carefully collected for forensic analysis. It was this discovery that immediately caught the attention of Toronto police. The name Dylan Millard, which had appeared in Laura Babcock's missing person file nearly a year earlier, had now resurfaced in an entirely different context. In September 2013, Toronto police, assisted by Hamilton police, returned to that same farm. This time, they were not searching for Tim Bosma, they were searching for Laura. The forensic team carried out a comprehensive search of the property. Every section of the land and every outbuilding was examined meticulously in an effort to find anything that could connect the location to Laura's disappearance. Despite the extensive search, no trace of Laura's remains was ever found there, or anywhere else, throughout the lengthy investigation that followed. What investigators did find, however, was a different kind of evidence. Digital evidence, purchase records for equipment, mobile phone location data preserved by telecommunications providers. When these pieces were placed together, they began to paint a very different picture of what had happened during the previous summer. Police also expanded their search to the bedroom of Millard's girlfriend, Christina Nauga. There, they seized 65 handwritten letters that Millard had written to her, letters that would later become an important part of the prosecution's case. At the same time, investigators re-interviewed everyone who had appeared in Laura's original file: friends, family members, and anyone who had been in contact with her during her final week. This time, the questioning was far more focused, concentrating specifically on the relationship between Laura and Millard. Sean Lerner, who had spent months conducting his own search, was also formally asked to assist. All of the information he had gathered, phone numbers, notes, and his small notebook, became valuable reference material for the investigative team. Police also re-examined all available mobile phone tower data, comparing the locations of Laura's, Millard's, and Smix's phones during the period surrounding 3 and 4 July 2012. When the original investigation began in 2012, this location data had not been fully exploited. By 2013, with assistance from specialists in telecommunications data analysis, investigators were gradually able to reconstruct detailed maps of the phone's movements. A joint investigative task force, bringing together Toronto Police and Hamilton Police, was established to coordinate the two cases and share all available evidence. It was an unusual but necessary approach, as the lines separating the Bosma investigation from the Babcock investigation became increasingly blurred by evidence linking the two together. For the Babcock family, news of the search at the farm brought mixed emotions: the first real glimmer of hope after months of frustration, but also growing fear about what that search might reveal. Clayton Babcock later admitted that the moment he learned police had discovered the incinerator on the property, he knew, deep down, that there was almost no hope left of finding his daughter alive. From that point onward, the Laura Babcock case was transformed completely from a forgotten missing person file into the centerpiece of one of the most complex and closely watched homicide investigations in Canadian criminal justice history. After it was seized, the animal incinerator became the centerpiece of the entire forensic investigation. Examining it was an extraordinarily complex process, requiring highly specialized expertise, analyzing ash and bone fragments that had survived exposure to extremely high temperatures. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to examine the small bone fragments recovered from the incinerator. This is a highly specialized field in which experts rely on the microscopic structure of bone to determine whether it is human or animal, a task made significantly more difficult when the material has been almost completely destroyed by fire. The initial findings proved highly controversial. Some experts concluded that the bone fragments were more likely to have come from animals than from a human, a conclusion that the defense would later rely on heavily before the jury. At the same time, forensic investigators collected soil samples from around the area where the incinerator had been located, searching for biological traces that might have seeped into the ground over the previous months. Although this technique rarely produces decisive results, it is a standard procedure in cases where no intact body has been recovered. Firearms experts also examined the handgun Millard had purchased before Laura disappeared, although they found no evidence that the weapon had ever been used. Digital forensic specialists joined the investigation as well, recovering data from numerous electronic devices belonging to both Millard and Smyk. Deleted text messages, internet search histories, and map applications, they had used every recoverable digital trace, became the subject of detailed forensic analysis. A handwriting expert was also asked to examine the 65 letters Millard had written to Nauga, confirming the authenticity of both the handwriting and the signature, and ruling out the possibility that the documents had been forged or altered. Meanwhile, telecommunications experts reconstructed the movements of Laura's, Millard's, and Smych's mobile phones throughout 3 and 4 July. The location data showed Laura's phone traveling in the same area as Millard's phone for several consecutive hours before it stopped transmitting altogether at a location near where Millard lived. This became one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence available to the prosecution. Even so, under strict legal standards, location data could establish only that the phones were in close proximity to one another. It could not prove what had actually happened there. Taken individually, none of the forensic findings, whether from bone analysis, soil testing, digital forensics, ballistics, or handwriting examination, was sufficient to prove that Laura was dead. Their real significance emerged only when they were considered together, forming a single overall picture. Legal commentators later described the case as one of the clearest modern examples of a homicide prosecution built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, a rare scientific and legal challenge in the history of modern criminal justice. For the prosecution, it also presented a major strategic challenge: how to explain dozens of separate, highly technical, and sometimes dry pieces of evidence in a way that an ordinary jury could understand and appreciate as a whole, without relying on graphic images or the kind of powerful physical evidence seen in most murder trials. The forensic examination continued for many months, demanding extraordinary patience from both the investigative team and the Babcock family, who waited anxiously through each new technical report, hoping that the final missing piece would eventually provide the certainty they had longed for throughout their ordeal. With Millard and Smitch now at the center of the investigation, prosecutors turned their attention to establishing motive, a critical element in any homicide case lacking direct physical evidence. Investigators reviewed the complete history of text messages exchanged between Millard and Christina Naudga over the months leading up to Laura's disappearance. Gradually, a picture emerged, a relationship marked by jealousy and control, in which Naudga repeatedly expressed her frustration over Laura's continued presence in Millard's life. On Laura's birthday in 2012, Laura and Naudga exchanged text messages teasing each other about their sexual relationship with Millard. Amid this growing tension, Millard sent Naudga a promise that prosecutors would later quote repeatedly at trial. He would remove Laura from both of their lives. Investigators also seriously considered the possibility that Laura had voluntarily left to start a new life elsewhere, the same explanation Millard had given Sean Lerner. However, the fact that Laura immediately and completely stopped using her bank accounts, health card, and every social media platform led investigators to quickly dismiss that theory. Christina Naudga also became the subject of a separate investigation. Police examined whether she had prior knowledge of any plan, or had even participated directly in any stage of what had happened. In April 2014, Naudga was formally charged as an accessory after the fact in connection with the Tim Bosma case, accused of knowing about the offense without reporting it, and of possibly helping to conceal evidence. At the same time, another development made the overall investigation far more complex. Police decided to reopen the investigation into the death of Dylan Millard's father, Wayne Millard, whose death in November 2012 had originally been ruled a suicide. The timing was striking. Wayne's death occurred only a few months after Laura disappeared, prompting investigators to consider whether there might be a recurring pattern of behavior. On 10 April 2014, Dylan Millard was formally charged with 2 additional counts of first-degree murder: the murder of his father, Wayne Millard, and the murder of Laura Babcock. On the same day, Mark Smitch was also charged in connection with Laura's murder. The Bosma, Babcock, and Wayne Millard cases were now linked within the broader investigation, although each would still be tried separately under Ontario's criminal justice process. For the prosecutors handling the Babcock case, establishing motive involved far more than a simple love triangle. They argued that both Millard and Smitch demonstrated a cold, a calculated mindset, in which eliminating people who had become inconvenient was viewed as a practical solution, a behavioral pattern they believed had repeated itself several times between mid-2012 and mid-2013. Although Christina Naudga was charged as an accessory after the fact in the Bosma case, she was never formally charged with any offense directly connected to Laura Babcock's death. In the end, her role in the Babcock case was limited to providing evidence through her testimony, as well as through the letters and text messages exchanged with Millard. With 3 major criminal investigations running at the same time, Ontario prosecutors faced the rare challenge of organizing multiple complex prosecutions. They had to determine the most appropriate order for the trials, avoid allowing evidence from one case to unfairly influence another, and at the same time protect the legal rights of both accused men throughout what would become years of court proceedings. Ultimately, the court ruled that the Bosma case would be tried first, followed by the Babcock case, and finally the Wayne Millard case. The sequence was based on the state of readiness of each prosecution and the timing of the formal charges. That decision meant the Babcock family would have to wait even longer before Laura's case could finally be presented to a jury. By the time additional charges were laid in the Laura Babcock case, both Dylan Millard and Mark Smich had already been in custody since May 2013 in connection with the Tim Bosma murder. As a result, no new arrests were required in the traditional sense. Instead, the two men were escorted to an Ontario courtroom to formally hear the additional charges. On 10 April 2014, both appeared in court wearing the standard orange prison uniforms. The hearing was brief and largely procedural, confirming the new charges and setting out the next stages of the legal process. Neither defense lawyer sought bail, with both men already facing first-degree murder charges in the Bosma case. The prospect of release was effectively non-existent, regardless of the additional accusations. News of the new charges was widely reported across Canada. For a public already following the Bosma investigation closely, the revelation that Millard and Smich were also linked to the mysterious disappearance of Laura Babcock from the previous year sent another wave of shock through the country. For the Babcock family, hearing that formal charges had finally been laid brought mixed emotions, relief, but also profound heartbreak. After nearly 2 years of uncertainty, Laura's disappearance was finally being addressed through official criminal proceedings. Speaking briefly to reporters outside the courthouse, Laura's father, Clayton Babcock, expressed his gratitude to the investigators who had pursued the case tirelessly for almost 2 years. At the same time, he acknowledged that his family still faced a long road before they could find any real sense of closure. Millard's lawyer confirmed that his client would plead not guilty to every charge across all 3 cases, the deaths of Tim Bosma, Laura Babcock, and Wayne Millard. Smich's legal team made the same declaration. More than 3.5 years passed between the filing of the charges and the start of Laura's trial. In Canada's justice system, such delays are not unusual in complex homicide cases involving multiple defendants and interconnected prosecutions, where protecting each accused person's right to fully prepare a defense is regarded as essential. During that period, both men remained in custody at correctional facilities in Ontario. Millard, still supported by significant family wealth, retained several lawyers throughout the pre-trial process before ultimately deciding to represent himself during the Babcock murder trial. Although representing oneself in a serious criminal case is uncommon, it is not unprecedented. Some defendants believe they can exercise greater control over their defense strategy by speaking directly to the jury rather than relying entirely on legal counsel. Despite repeated warnings from legal experts about the considerable risks associated with that decision, the Bosma trial was heard first, in 2016. Both Millard and Smich were found guilty by the jury and sentenced to life imprisonment. Although that verdict was legally separate from Laura Babcock's case, it carried important significance. It demonstrated that a Canadian jury could be persuaded by a carefully constructed circumstantial case, even where investigators had never recovered a complete body. For the Babcock family, the outcome of the Bosma trial offered a measure of hope. If a jury was prepared to accept a case built largely on circumstantial evidence once before, perhaps the same would be possible when Laura's case finally reached the courtroom. In October 2017, more than 5 years after Laura Babcock disappeared, her murder trial finally opened before the Ontario Superior Court in Toronto, marking the beginning of the final stage in her family's long search for justice. On the opening day of the trial, Millard stood and questioned Laura's father, Clayton Babcock, himself. His very first question left the courtroom in stunned silence. "Are you worried?" It was a shocking moment that immediately set the tone for the 7-week trial that followed. Acting as his own lawyer, the accused man personally cross-examined the father of the woman he was charged with murdering. Throughout the proceedings, Millard served both as the accused and as his own defense counsel. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged evidence, and presented arguments directly to the jury without the assistance of a defense lawyer. The approach created an unusual legal situation. Laura's family, as the indirect victims of the crime, were forced to face the man accused of taking her life while giving evidence, without the professional buffer that normally exists between witnesses and the accused. Midway through the trial, Millard applied to have the proceedings declared a mistrial, arguing that his legal rights had been seriously compromised. Justice Michael Code carefully considered the application but ultimately dismissed it, allowing the trial to continue as scheduled. Many legal observers noted that, while representing himself gave Millard complete control over his defense, it also exposed significant weaknesses. Lacking formal legal training, he sometimes struggled to frame questions effectively or present arguments that carried weight with the jury. For Sean Lerner and several other witnesses who were questioned directly by Millard, the experience was emotionally taxing. They were required not only to answer the usual courtroom questions but also to remain composed while being cross-examined by the very man they believed was responsible for their friend's disappearance. Mark Smich adopted an entirely different strategy. Represented by defense lawyer Thomas Dungy, he remained largely silent throughout the trial, rarely showing any visible emotion as the evidence was presented. Dungy followed a more conventional defense approach, focusing primarily on challenging the reliability of the circumstantial evidence rather than confronting witnesses in the direct manner Millard often chose. The stark contrast between the two defense strategies, one confrontational and highly personal, the other cautious and legally structured, created a unique dynamic inside the courtroom. Journalists who covered the 7-week trial closely noted the striking differences in how the two accused men responded to the very same body of evidence. Under Canadian law, the right to remain silent allows an accused person to choose not to testify and not to incriminate themselves. It is a fundamental constitutional protection, and the jury was formally instructed by the judge that no adverse inference could be drawn from either man's decision not to take the witness stand. In practice, however, many legal psychology experts have observed that prolonged silence from both accused, while fully protected by law, you can still leave a lasting impression on jurors, particularly after they have spent weeks hearing an extensive body of circumstantial evidence that, taken together, appears to tell a coherent story. For the Babcock family, watching both accused choose silence brought mixed emotions. On one hand, they were spared hearing explanations that might have caused further pain. On the other, they were left without what they had sought for years, a direct answer to the question that had haunted them ever since Laura disappeared: what truly happened to her. After 2.5 days presenting his defense, Millard announced that his case was complete. Shortly afterwards, Smitch's legal team also confirmed that they would call no further witnesses. The trial then entered its final stage, the closing submissions. For the jury, the next task was clear. After hearing the closing arguments and carefully reviewing all of the evidence presented over the previous weeks, they would decide the ultimate fate of both accused men. On 5 December, the closing arguments officially began. Standing before the jury, the Crown prosecutor faced the greatest challenge of the entire case: how to convince 12 ordinary citizens, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Laura was dead when not a single part of her body had ever been found. The prosecutor did not shy away from that challenge. Instead, they confronted it directly, reminding the jury of the testimony given by Laura's family. Just 3 days before she disappeared, she had left her suitcase, cash, and her dog, Lacey, at her parents' home. Those were not the belongings of someone preparing to walk away and start a new life. More than 80 exhibits and the testimony of 40 witnesses were brought together into a single, coherent narrative, the motive arising from the love triangle, the preparation demonstrated by the purchase of the handgun and the animal incinerator, the opportunity established through mobile phone location data, and the conduct after Laura's disappearance, reflected in the 65 letters Millard wrote to construct an alternative version of events. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Canadian law does not require a body in order to secure a murder conviction. Circumstantial evidence, when it is sufficiently strong and consistent, carries the same legal weight as direct evidence. Before the jury retired to deliberate, Justice Michael Code delivered detailed legal instructions on how circumstantial evidence should be assessed. He explained that the jury did not need a confession, nor did they need direct evidence showing the act itself. What they needed was proof beyond a reasonable doubt, based on the totality of the evidence presented throughout the trial. In his own closing address, Millard again maintained that the Crown had failed to prove Laura was actually dead. He argued that without a body, the prosecution lacked the most fundamental piece of evidence in any homicide case. Mark Smitch's lawyer, Thomas Dungy, focused his closing argument on drawing a clear distinction between the roles of the two accused. He argued that even if the jury believed Millard was involved, that did not automatically mean Smitch should bear the same level of criminal responsibility. This is a common legal strategy in multi-defendant trials, to separate each accused person's level of responsibility, creating reasonable doubt for one client even if the broader allegations against the group cannot be entirely dismissed. In the Crown's final reply, the prosecutor returned to the evidence directly linking the two accused the testimony concerning Smitch's rap lyrics, their joint activities surrounding the purchase and transport of the animal incinerator, and the mobile phone data showing that the two men remained together throughout the critical period. This was not, the Crown argued, two separate stories, but a shared plan carried out by two people acting toward the same objective. For the Babcock family, sitting through all three closing addresses, the Crown's, Smitch's defense, and Millard's own argument was an emotionally overwhelming experience. Every argument and every interpretation of the evidence brought both hope and anxiety about what the final verdict would be. On 12 December, after completing his final legal instructions, Justice Code formally handed the case to the jury. 12 ordinary citizens entered the jury room carrying the responsibility of deciding the fate of two men based on 7 weeks of evidence presented before them. For the Babcock family, and for everyone who had followed the case for years, there was nothing left to do but wait, hoping that the final answer, however painful it might be, would soon be delivered. The jury began its deliberations on Tuesday afternoon. 4 days passed in tense silence. Then, on Saturday, 16 December 2017, word reached the courtroom. A verdict had been reached. Both Millard and Smich were found guilty of first-degree murder, the most serious homicide offense under Canadian criminal law. As the verdict was read, members of the Babcock family, along with several jurors, broke down in tears. Mixed with the sobbing were quiet cheers that echoed through the courtroom. Speaking on behalf of the family, Clayton Babcock delivered a brief statement, describing the entire 7-week trial as a 6-week funeral, a phrase that captured exactly what his family had endured throughout the proceedings. Under Canadian law, a conviction for first-degree murder automatically carries a sentence of life imprisonment, with no eligibility for parole for at least 25 years. All 12 jurors recommended that Millard's sentence be served consecutively to the one he had already received. Only 5 jurors made the same recommendation for Smich, while the remaining 7 made no recommendation. The formal sentencing hearing was scheduled for 12 February 2018, the very day Laura would have celebrated her 29th birthday had she still been alive. When delivering the final sentence, Justice Michael Code used uncompromising language to describe Millard, calling him profoundly immoral and dangerous. As for Smich, the judge found that he had participated in the entire crime enthusiastically. Justice Code also rejected Millard's attempt to persuade the jury that there was a redeeming side hidden beneath his cold exterior. Millard is skillful and sophisticated in displaying socially acceptable behavior when it serves his interests, the judge observed. Justice Code ruled that the sentence imposed in the Babcock case would be served consecutively to the sentence already imposed in the Bosma case. Taking into account the time they had already spent in custody, neither Millard nor Smich would become eligible for parole until 206345 years from the date of sentencing. As soon as the judge left the courtroom, cheers and applause broke out from the public gallery. Members of the Babcock and Bosma families embraced one another, sharing a moment both families had waited years to see. Both Millard and Smich appeared tearful as they were handcuffed and escorted from the courtroom. For Clayton Babcock, the sight stirred no sympathy. We have to admit, it was satisfying to see them handcuffed, walking to the prison van, heading toward a life that most of us could never imagine enduring. He told reporters after the sentencing hearing. He added, in a reflective tone, "Somehow, even life imprisonment still seems too lenient when Laura never even had the chance to celebrate her 24th birthday." Outside the courtroom, the Canadian public largely welcomed the sentence. Media outlets across the country reported extensively on the case, with many publishing in-depth analyses of how the Crown had successfully secured convictions based almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, a significant legal precedent that Canadian criminal lawyers would continue to study. For years to come, for the Babcock family, the sentence brought to a close a legal battle that had lasted nearly 6 years. But as Clayton later acknowledged, justice being served could never fill the void Laura's absence left in their lives every single day. In Etobicoke, where Laura had grown up, news of the verdict spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to a community that had followed the case for years. Laura Babcock was never found. No traditional funeral was ever held for her, and there is no grave bearing her name for her family to visit each year. Perhaps this is the most painful part of the entire story. Justice was ultimately served, but the sense of closure that comes from being able to lay a loved one to rest was forever taken away from the Babcock family. Sean Lerner, Laura's former boyfriend, who began his own amateur investigation in the summer of 2012, has since been widely regarded as the key figure who prevented the case from fading into complete obscurity. Without the Facebook group he created, and without the notebook in which he meticulously recorded every phone call, the connection between Laura and Millard might never have been fully documented in the early stages of the investigation. The Laura Babcock case also left an important legal legacy for Canada's justice system. It became one of the clearest examples of a successful murder conviction based entirely on circumstantial evidence, a precedent that prosecutors across other Canadian provinces would later look to when faced with similar cases in which the victim's body had never been recovered. For the Bosma family, their story became inseparable from that of the Babcock family. Two families who had never known each other before tragedy struck were now forever connected by the same two men, the same courtroom, and the same painful journey in pursuit of justice that lasted for years. The Wayne Millard case, the third murder allegation brought against Dylan Millard, was ultimately never brought to trial, with 2 life sentences already imposed, and no possibility of parole until 2063. Ontario prosecutors decided there was little practical need to pursue a third trial that would consume significant additional resources while doing virtually nothing to change Millard's ultimate fate. Laura's friends Jessica Trevors, Stefan Blasiak, and Elizabeth van Rensburg, who had spent some of her final days with her, have continued to remember her as a cheerful, funny young woman who always tried to make the people around her laugh, even during one of the most difficult periods of her life. The short video Blasiak recorded on the night of 1 July, just 2 days before Laura disappeared, became one of the last images the public would ever see of her, a moment in which she jokingly meowed like a cat and burst into laughter, completely unaware that it would be one of the last times her friends would ever see her so full of life. More than a complex criminal case, Laura Babcock's story stands as a reminder of the value of persistence from a former boyfriend who refused to give up, to a team of prosecutors willing to pursue a case that many others might have considered impossible in the absence of the single most important piece of evidence.